Hello and welcome to Scottish Independence Podcasts. As you know, we occasionally feature episodes of Independence Live's TNT show, and that's what we're doing this week. The guest was Graeme McCormick, who you may remember stated his intention to stand in the SNP's leadership contest. In the event, as we know, John Swinney stood unopposed. In this podcast, Graeme covers both the topic of how you might go about dissolving a union, but also brings us up to date on, what led to his decision not to challenge for the leadership, and it is quite interesting. So hope you enjoy it.
Hello and welcome to the TNT show. I'm John Drummond, your host. And who is our guest tonight? Well, I'm happy that we'll be able to join by Graeme McCormick. Hello and welcome to Graeme. We're delighted you can join us. I think one of the things you wanted to talk about in particular was dissolution. Tell us what you mean by dissolution and how it would work.
Right. Well, dissolution of a union is recognised internationally as a legal way of dissolving a union. It happened most recently or in connection with the former Czechoslovakia, where that union was dissolved, and Slovakia and the Czech Republic went their separate ways. It's also recognised in international law in the Vienna Convention of, I think it's 1983, in which, in the event of a unilateral dissolution by one former partner, then there are certain rules which are set out in the convention as regards the separation of assets and responsibilities of the the partners of the former state. So it's perfectly recognisable as a legal international route to independence.
So how would it work? Say, for example, after this election, there was a general view in Scotland that the union just hadn't worked. Not just that the BBC and the media hadn't worked, but the union wasn't working, and that the percentage of people who took that view was greater than 50%. How would the process work? What would be the first step?
Well, I think the first step would be that the independence supporting parties would need to have as part of their manifesto to the public, to make it clear to the public and also to the unionists, that in the event of there being a majority of the popular vote in Scotland in favour of parties supporting the dissolution of the United Kingdom, then on that happening, then the majority vote was carried at that election, then what would then happen would be for the Scottish MPs, independence supporting Scottish MPs, to walk out of Westminster to declare that the union was dissolved, set up a provisional government and parliament in Edinburgh, a sovereign one. This is separate from the current devolved Scottish Parliament, and advise the international community that the union is dissolved and that Scotland will adhere to the terms of the Vienna Convention on the dissolution of a union. Okay,
that sounds perfectly straightforward. But let's look at the detail now. You say a majority. How would this majority be established? I mean, would it be if the SNP, just take the SNP on its own for a second, there may be other independence parties as we know, but let's say the SNP has a majority of seats on July the 4th. Would that constitute a majority?
Well, my personal view would be that would not be sufficient for the international community. I think the international community would want to see that a majority of the popular vote had been carried and not just a majority of the seats, because you've basically got to show that the majority of the people who are prepared to vote have done so for dissolution of the union. I think in order to do it by purely the number of MPs who are elected, I think would fall short of what the international community would consider an acceptable norm.
It is a strange one. I mean, it effectively what you've just said is that any secession would have to have a greater support than that which is required to form a UK government, where if I have one seat more than you, I'm the government.
We're dealing in the international arena because we're talking basically about the end of a treaty.
Yeah,
and I think that's different. And of course, every country's got its own means by which it votes, votes Parliament, etc.
If, for example, Graeme, in addition to having the majority of MPs, when the votes are all counted up, it turns out that, for the sake of discussion, the SNP has one more vote than all the others. Therefore, i.e., a majority have voted for a separatist outcome.
Yeah.
Would that be sufficient?
Well, that would be sufficient on the basis that it was a majority vote. Obviously, there are practicalities involved in this, and one would also have to be, I suppose, aware and responsive to the attitude and the feeling of those who did not vote for the independence, and what their reaction is likely to be. So, these are things you've got to be aware of. So, preferably, it would be far better if we got 60% of the popular vote as opposed to, 50% plus one. But these are practical issues that, to some extent, will be determined by the personalities involved in both sides of the political fence, and also how the general population will feel about that. Because what's happened now is that we are not dealing with a nice Mr. Cameron. We are dealing with people who are in the UK parties who are very, very unlikely to agree to a referendum or agree to a dissolution or, Scotland becoming independent. So, these people are basically political thugs. So, unless they were going to actually sort of change their attitude, we have got to have a means by which we've got to decide whether we are just a pressure group and we keep asking and pressing, etc., in the hope that at some point in the future, the UK government of the day will be reasonable, or we have to basically take the law, and it is the law, international law, into our own hands and say, look here, if you are not prepared to accept that we have a popular mandate to become independent, then we are going to dissolve the union. Now, the big do we use to actually dissolve the union? Is it going to be the case that if we were successful and had a small majority in favour of dissolving the union, then would that encourage or force the United Kingdom government to actually start to negotiate? And I think probably it's the case that they reluctantly would have to do that, because be in no doubt, because we do not discuss dissolution of the union, that makes the UK parties much more comfortable than if we did discuss it, because dissolution is something which they would actually fear. Because with dissolution, what it means is that without an agreement between the two former partners, then one side cannot take a unilateral action which was of the former state of which they were formerly part.
We talked about dissolution, we talked about a majority. We've had folks online saying, look, maybe what ought to happen is that the SNP should withdraw and set up a constitutional convention. Is that something you would approve of?
Well, I don't have any objection to a constitutional convention, but the thing is that that has got to be very much a supporting role. At the end of the day, the decision has got to be made by the Scottish MPs, because they have the people by the Treaty of Union that have the right to be represented and form part of the United Kingdom Parliament. And they are the people who have the right to withdraw, because they are basically the successors of the original Scottish MPs. Their right to be there is based on the treaty. It's not based on any Westminster statute or anything like that. So that's why the legal way to dissolve the union is for our representatives, the majority of our representatives, to walk out and dissolve the union. It's actually as simple as that, albeit obviously there's considerable detail that would, and practicalities that would be involved and would have to be recognised and dealt with. But these could be dealt with. But that's the basis. They walk out and say, we declare the union dissolved. And in order to get international legitimacy, they've got to do that on the basis of a majority of the popular vote of Scotland in favour of that.
Well, not just a popular majority, but also a majority of the MPs from Scotland, I gather.
Yes, no. If you got a majority of the popular vote, then you would get a majority of the MPs.
Well, not necessarily on first past the post.
well, I think you would find you would, because with first past the post, if you get about 40 to 42% of the popular vote, you'll get probably the vast majority of the seats too. But I mean, with 50, if you get just over the 50%, then you're likely to. I think it's more or less a done deal that you would get a significant majority of the seats. But that's by the way. But the position is that in order to satisfy international norms, we have to get a majority of the popular vote. That's the position.
And are you happy with the SNP's position?
No, I'm not happy. In fact, I tried to change it at the last conference, but the conference committee wouldn't accept the resolution that was proposed. So basically, I had to move the direct negative to what was proposed, and I was unsuccessful in that. But I mean, I know, having talked to a few of the leaders in the SNP, they agree with me that the chances of a UK government and Prime Minister agreeing to another referendum is few and far between. It's virtually impossible. So we're now going to have to sort of discuss, what we can do in order to deliver independence, and not just, speak about it and promote it. But because what is crucial in my view is that with 50% plus of the people being for independence, but only roughly, say, 35% of the population or the electorate is saying they're going to support the SNP, then the SNP has got to concentrate on that missing 15%. And why are they not supporting the SNP? I would humbly suggest that we have not a delivery mechanism. We've been trying to advance independence. So if you can deliver it, you deliver it. If not, you're just a pressure group. And I think you've got to be honest with the public and say you're either a delivery unit or you are a pressure group. And that's the debate which we now have to have in Scotland.
The SNP's been at this business now for 50 odd years, maybe more.
No, I mean, Margaret Thatcher said we had to vote for it. Now, I'm not sure whether it was, I think in her stage it was a majority of the seats, but I don't think that is sustainable, as I've already said. But the introduction of the Scottish Parliament actually did not actually affect the legal position of our right to dissolve, because the Parliament is a creation of Westminster. So we've actually got to go back to what if the Parliament had never been created, or what if in 1975, when we had the SNP breakthrough, and what if they had actually won a majority of the vote or the seats at that particular stage? What would have been the position then? Well, the position would have been that we could have actually proceeded to dissolve the Union. And that position has not been changed by the intervention of the Scottish Parliament at all, in a legal sense at all. Because, as I say, the Scottish Parliament is a creation of the Westminster system. It's not basically anything to do with the Treaty of Union as such.
From what I gather, the SNP is saying if they get a majority of the seats, then that will be regarded as an important factor in deciding what to do with the Union. At present, the SNP has a majority of the seats and isn't doing anything about it.
Well, I mean, the position is that you get a majority of the seats, and they've said that would then allow them to start to negotiate. But you can only negotiate if you've got somebody who's prepared to negotiate on the other side.
What's the difference between the future majority and the present majority?
People would say that the current SNP MPs were not elected on basically a mandate to dissolve the Union or negotiate the dissolution of the Union or independence. But, I mean, I'm not saying support that, but that would be their excuse.
It makes absolutely no sense. The SNP has made clear for decades now that it is a party whose aim is separation. To turn around and say, we just found out that you're separatists, it is an extraordinary argument.
I don't doubt the illogicality of the whole thing at all. But I mean, we are where we are. They weren't prepared to basically take the matter in their own hands. They would probably say that they did try to negotiate in some shape or form, but it was obviously not particularly enthusiastically done, or done with any particular great vigour. So the position is that we are where we are, and in order, I think, to proceeds to negotiate the dissolution of the union, then you've basically got to impose a sanction, because otherwise the other side won't do anything. And the sanction is that if you do not negotiate and discuss this with us and we come to an agreement, then we will dissolve the union. That is the sanction. But we don't discuss that. We don't challenge the unionists to that. And it was interesting what Martin Geisler, when he challenged Cole Hamilton on the Sunday show about basically what the mechanism for Scotland becoming independent was. And of course, he was all over the place, the guy, Cole Hamilton. He just didn't know, or he wasn't prepared to speak about that. So we've got to actually speak about it ourselves and challenge them, say, we are serious about a dissolution of the union. And you've got to remember that a dissolution of the union is not a unilateral declaration of independence. That's what colonies do. We are not a colony. We are part of a voluntary union, which the unionists love to tell us. So in order to leave that union, we can do it voluntarily. And that's what we're going to do, unless they come to the table and actually discuss and negotiate how we're going to separate. And the other thing I would say is that, this can be a positive thing, particularly for England too. They should look, and the SNP and other nationalists should actually be saying to our English friends, consider what dissolution of the union, what benefits you would get from that too. Consider what would be good and advantageous for you, so that we basically rejig the whole relationship in these islands about how we go forward. And I think that there is a positivity in that, and it's not purely a negative thing at all for England. England is a great country. It's got very many attributes, but it's different from us. It's got really probably different outlooks, different values in many respects. And they've got to find their own way in the world, just as we've got to find our own way too.
Graeme, at one point you were down to run against John Swinney for leader of the SNP, but you changed your mind. Why was that?
Well, basically, I was approached 2 days before the deadline by a government minister, not John, and they tried to persuade me not to stand, and they said I wouldn't win, and I said, well, with all due respect, you don't know that. But basically, I was invited to speak to John, and John phoned me, and he then invited me up to his home to have a meeting, and we had a meeting on the Sunday, by which time I had the requisite number of votes. Not only that, I had over 40 constituencies represented in these votes, so I had more than covered the threshold. But we had a long discussion. It was well over an hour, and I went to him with certain proposals that I thought were really essential to be part of the Scottish Government and the SNP's programme in order to deliver independence. And in the course of the conversation, it became very plain to me that John and I actually shared an awful lot of what I was trying to say and what I was trying to persuade the party to do. And he actually turned to me towards the end of the conversation and said, look, I will give you a note of my responses to your particular issues which you've raised. And if you're happy with that, would you be prepared to give me the opportunity to go ahead as the leader of the party? So it was his initiative. He provided me with this note, and he wanted it to be kept, the actual detail of it to be kept private, just which I have agreed to. But I have this note, which gave me the confidence, which I hope is not misplaced. I don't think it will be, but gave me the confidence to think that he is going to basically make or attempt to make significant changes, both internally and also in the approach to independence, which the party must have. Because, as I've said before, it's only through our MPs, our political representatives, that we are actually going to be able to deliver independence at the end of the day in a legal way which is accepted by the international community.
What did he change his mind about that convinced you?
Well, I'm not saying he changed his mind. Actually, from the conversation I had, I think actually he's probably felt a lot of the same things I felt for some considerable time. I've mentioned to you about the fact that we think it is highly unlikely that there would be a UK Prime Minister who would be prepared to give Scotland a referendum. I think he also agrees with me that is it possible now to both manage devolution and also deliver independence? Because what has happened since Brexit and this the introduction of what shall we call muscular unionism, that the actual powers of the Scottish Parliament are getting less now the longer the SNP are in power as a devolved administration. And I think he recognised that to be the case. So we're at this sort of crossroads here, is can you actually manage devolution now as well as prosecute independence?
I think that's the trouble. I think the concern a lot of people have is that they see lots of the former and not much of the latter.
Well, I think that's right. But of course, we do remember that, the SNP took the view that they would seek to, they would cooperate with the devolution project, and they would seek to become the government and try and govern in a responsible way. And I think, despite all the kind of problems which there have been late, which I think are much less than what people like to think they are, they have done very well, because the position is that we enjoy in Scotland far better benefits and rights, even within the devolved situation, than our friends in England or Wales have. And as a result, so the SNP have done pretty well. They've done pretty well as managing devolution. But we've now reached a stage, because of this muscular unionism from Westminster, where there is more than a question mark about whether you can actually continue to manage devolution while prosecuting independence. Now, my thought is that, and I've always thought this about being an SNP government, a devolved government, is that you should act as if you're already independent as much as you possibly can. Now, we know there are constraints within the devolution settlement regarding that, but we haven't actually, our government hasn't actually explored to what extent they can actually push these boundaries of devolution.
Yeah. I would agree with all of that. I think the independence parties have been very unassertive when it comes to the Constitution. And that's a sad thing. And it suggests that there isn't the depth of knowledge there on a technical level that would give people confidence, and certainly doesn't give them confidence of working outside the boundaries set by Westminster. I think within those boundaries, there's a high comfort level. I think outside of those boundaries, there isn't much of a confidence level. The Westminster has become much more assertive on the Constitution. They're in the driver's seat because power devolved is power retained. So any time they can breach their own arrangement, they can break at any time on any pretext. They could abolish the Scottish Parliament. And people say, well, they wouldn't do that because it would create a problem. Well, so what, they'll say. Who cares? Keir Starmer, for example, may say, look, I'm sitting in a majority of 200 to 300 MPs. The hell do I care? And I think the point has been reached now where there has to be diplomatic efforts, but they need to be assertive, as Graeme was suggesting. It's not sufficient to sit back and say, well, in the fullness of time, a Westminster government will emerge, which will be sensitive. Frankly, I can't see it. There is nothing in the track record that suggests any such thing may happen.
Well, yes, I would agree with that, but I think that is one of the matters which I discussed and reached some agreement on with John. So I think to a certain extent, maybe because this general election has arrived sooner than we thought, that has to some extent had affected it. But I fully expected that by the time we got to our national conference at the end of August, there would be certain indications that there was going to be a change of emphasis, a change in the policies of the party and also the Scottish government. Because the one thing I did ask him, and which he did accede to in the report, is that it wasn't just going to be party policy that was going to be reviewed and things, it was also the Scottish government. And obviously, because of the result of the general election, that will obviously have a bearing on what is decided and discussed at the national conference, because we thought the National Conference was going to be before the general election, but obviously it's not going to be now. That will have an effect on it, but it shouldn't necessarily affect the overall principle of, our route or the different routes to independence which might still be available to us. And we shouldn't actually cancel anything out, but we should actually be in control of certain routes which we can do legally in an international context, and be very well aware of that.
I think that makes a lot of sense. I mean, the main party of independence is somewhat unassertive when it comes to changing the constitution. It seems to be very leery. It seems to have an easy acceptance of the fact that Westminster runs things, and you don't want to be too pushy. You don't want to be seen as being overly dogmatic, and you're going to spend most of your time waiting until Westminster somehow comes to a view that what you've been saying for 100 years has some validity. I think it must strike a lot of people as being a somewhat tepid way of presenting your case.
Yeah, I think one of the things to bear in mind is that we have a civil service, which is the British civil service. And with all due respect to the civil servants who advise the Scottish Government, there are bound to be some of them who are not particularly well inclined towards independence. And I have certainly found in relation to other matters where the advice given to Scottish ministers by civil servants has been wrong.
I would agree with that. I mean, there's no question. I mean, my experience of dealing with the administration and the Scottish Government was that they were stuffed to the gunnels with lawyers, which they construed as being the same thing as constitutional experts, and they're just not the same thing. But equally, I found ministers far too willing to accept advice from people who really didn't know what they were talking about.
I agree entirely with that, and I have challenged Scottish Government ministers on different points. And, I've even had them admit and say, well, I didn't know that was the case. And then in the next breath say, I have every confidence in my civil servants.
Yeah, I found that too.
The one other thing that I did suggest, and I don't know whether this will be pushed forward or not, but I thought it was really important that we have an independence delivery unit. Yeah. Without civil servants, but basically created by the leader of the party and the First Minister. And these would be people who are basically recognised nationalists who have done an awful lot of the spade work, whether it's on currency, on the national banks, on constitutional law, all these things, but actually get them in the room to work for a limited period of time.
More than anything else, I'll tell you what they need. They need somebody who's an expert on constitutions elsewhere.
We already have that, and in fact, there is a shovel-ready constitution already available to get us over the line.
Yeah, I know. I was involved with Mike and also with Elliot Boomer in making sure that happened. That took decades, Graeme. And it
but I mean, it's basically ready now, so it's available in order to get us over the line.
The key thing is not to have it ready. The key thing is to educate people as to why it's necessary, because unless I'm very much mistaken, most people inside the SNP, and certainly most Scots, don't regard a constitution as being anything useful. And unless you change that attitude, it's going to be very difficult to implement constitutional change because people don't know what it is. And I hear government ministers south of the border talking about, well, that's unconstitutional, as if it had some relevance or meaning. It just doesn't. In the British setting, that is an irrelevant comment because there's no way to prove one way or the other because it's not written down in any specific place. So anybody can say anything. I think what they mean, sorry, just let me finish. I think what they mean is it's unconventional, which is a very different thing.
No, I would take the view that what we're talking about is a constitution which we can introduce on day one of independence, and then which, as I say, is already it's up and ready, and it's not going to scare the horses. It's pretty conventional in the way it's been drafted, etc. It doesn't go into the issue of, for example, of whether we're going to be a monarchy or a republic. That can wait until later when as a nation we can discuss what the next constitution is going to be when we are independent. But the position is, I would say as a lawyer, I would say actually we are in a better position in the fact that Britain does not have a specific written down constitutional document. You know, I think there's advantages for us to have that. Not having a so-called written constitution such as they have in Spain, etc. You know, so I don't think that's a problem. But I think if we start discussing the issue of dissolution, and particularly discussing it and taking it to our opponents in the unionist side, they will then start to be in the back foot, because then it's all part of trying to justify the union as well, and why we shouldn't dissolve it. So it really puts them on the defensive, and that is the thing we've not been doing. We've not been putting them on the defensive.
Couldn't agree more. I think it was, I can't remember who said it now, but independence is never granted, it's taken.
That's right. Mm-hmm.
And the reason for that is very simple. Why should anyone disturb the status quo? Graeme, this has been a really good discussion, and I hope that you're able to continue, and I hope that these discussions that you had bear fruit. And there is one little favour I'd like to ask of you, and it's this. If you are in contact with John Swinney, on behalf of us, you might care to invite him on the show on our behalf. Mm-hmm. If you're in touch with him,
I think it's going to be very exciting to see what's happening in the next 2 or 3 months, culminating with the party conference, and I hope, and I'm looking for signs that there are significant changes, and that we become much more determined in delivering independence and not just talking about it.
Great, that's fantastic. Now, thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Well, that was quite an intriguing discussion, wasn't it? It'll be very interesting to see what happens next, particularly as we start to get to grips with the results of the general election, which, of course, at the time I'm recording this, I have no idea what it's going to be. So thanks for listening, everybody, and we'll be back with another episode next Friday. Bye now.